Welcome. Okay, these are a series of videos, and I'm going to be laying down some of the basic structure of the class. So you can use these to come back and look at again. You can use them for when you're preparing for tests. But hopefully these will reinforce kind of the main content of the class as we go through the semester. So first, I'd like to start with foundations. Our first unit, we talk about foundations. And I would like to focus here in class. We talked about the roots of democracy. We talked about the Magna Carta, John Locke's natural law. But I'd like to focus now on really the development of the American democracy of the United States, democracy in the United States. Okay, so we know that at the beginning there were colonies, British colonies. And in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, at the moment that the Declaration was signed, I asked in class, were there any governments that existed in the United States? And hopefully when you think about that, you will realize that the answer is absolutely yes. There were 13 governments. New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, the 13 colonies. They already existed. They had legislatures, they had governors, they had court systems. So they were fully developed first colonial governments that were acting in tandem with the British Crown. But ultimately, upon independence, they started acting independently of the Crown, and they were the government for their respective colonies under the Crown, and when independence was declared, they became states. All right, so we talked about the first governing document of the United States. So take a minute, see if you can bring to your mind what was the first governing document that was created. Hopefully you will remember the timeline. So on the timeline that we point to in class a lot, 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. 1788 was the ratification of the Constitution. What was the governing document in that 12-year period between 1776 and 1788? And hopefully you know that that was the Articles of Confederation. All right. So we're going to look for a moment at the word confederacy. What is a confederate government? And we're going to contrast it with a federal system. Okay, under the Articles of Confederation, we know that under Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, it stated that the states retained sovereignty, freedom, and independence. It also stated that later in the Articles that the Articles could not be amended unless there was unanimous agreement by all the states to amend them. And we also looked at the fact in Article 3 of the Articles that it said that they were created in order to establish a firm league of friendship. So the government created by the Articles of Confederation was one that gave the states a lot of power. The states retained sovereignty, freedom, and independence. And they came together to create a firm league of friendship. So under the Articles, there were a number of powers that we talked about in class that the central government created by the Articles lacked. First of all, it lacked the power to tax. It could not directly tax the people. It could ask the states, hey, can you give us some money? You want us to fight the Revolutionary War? We need some money to do that. So they could ask the states for money, but they could not directly tax the people. Second, they could not control commerce among the states. And that was very important because at the time what was happening, let's create our state borders. It doesn't make much sense, but we're going to use Colorado. These were not in the original United States. Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. Now, we talked about the fact that this is interstate commerce, and this, A is intrastate, B is interstate commerce. Commerce moving among several states. The government created by the Articles did not have the power to control interstate commerce. So what the state governments were doing is they were putting up tariff barriers. And what that would mean is, let's say someone in Arizona wanted to, was growing a crop, and they wanted to sell it in Colorado, crossing through Utah in the meantime. What happened is that the states were putting up essentially tariffs at their border to say, okay, if you want access to our market, you will need to pay a tariff for the privilege of selling your goods in our market. That was not the idea that anybody had had. Everyone had had this concept that there would be a free and open market among the states, but that's not what was happening, because the states were using the fact that other states, I should say, private either farmers or manufacturers wanted to sell goods in their state. Really, there wasn't much manufacturing back then, so it was predominantly agricultural goods. Okay, so the bottom line is that there was a big problem. There were barriers at state lines that were stopping the free flow of goods. All of these things created problems. First of all, the states were putting up tariff barriers. Second of all, the federal government could not tax. And of course, when we talked about the period when the Articles of Confederation were governing, Shays' Rebellion happened, a rebellion of farmers in the Connecticut Valley. They were burning down courthouses and attacking tax collectors. The federal government did not have the money and the resources to effectively put down Shays' Rebellion. So that's why in 1788, the Constitutional Convention was held. They couldn't amend the Articles because they knew that they needed unanimous agreement to change them, and they wouldn't get a unanimous agreement. All right, the last point I want to make about the Articles of Confederation, the problems under those articles, was the type of representation there was. So under the Articles, each state, and this is again in Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. So we talked about the fact that if you have one state that has 10,000 people and one state that has 1,000 people, which state gets a better deal getting one vote? The smaller states have a great deal if you're doing this equal representation. Every state gets the same number of votes. The larger states have a terrible deal. On a per capita basis, they have much less representation. But of course, the smaller states wouldn't agree to change this, so there was no way they were going to be able to amend the Articles in light of the need for unanimous agreement to do that. Okay, so what happened instead is that they ended up throwing out the Articles and writing the Constitution. Everybody understood when they got together to create the Constitution that they needed to create a more powerful, a stronger central government. But they were nervous about that. They were nervous because of their experience with the Crown and because their experience with Great Britain during the colonial era. So what they did was they created a government that was much stronger than the government had been under the Articles of Confederation. And yet they created structures that they built into the Constitution to ensure that that power could be limited and restricted, that that power wouldn't be abused. And essentially that is going to be the outline of the class that we do. So how did the Constitution change? First of all, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, it gave the federal government the power to tax. Second of all, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, it gave the federal government the power to control commerce among the several states. Next, the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, it gave Congress the power to do that which it would need to do in order to carry out the express powers. And finally, Article 6, Section 2, the Supremacy Clause. Okay, we'll continue in the next lecture.